Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And today let's look at the issues of fishing and casting an integrated line versus a shooting head system with a loop-to-loop connection like this one right here. Now, there's advantages to both systems. And what I see as an issue is people sometimes get married to one system and they try to make it fit all situations. And it doesn't always work out well, especially with these loop-to-loop connections and shooting head systems, trying to make it do jobs where it doesn't really fit all that well. So we're going to look at some of these issues and some of the good points and bad points, so as to help you make a decision as to whether you should be using one line system or the other, or maybe a combination of both like I do here. I use both systems, so I'm not married to one or the other. I'll use them wherever they're appropriately used. So let's start off with looking at the the shooting head system. So we have the loop-to-loop connection, like I said here, and you can, disconnect it and change heads. Here's a scout head, Airflow Scout. And you can have a bag full of heads that you can change. One of the great advantages, of course, is that you're not stuck with one company. Here's a Rio shooting head I could have put on my Airflow running line. So if I like Airflow running lines and like Rio shooting heads, I can combine the two. It doesn't matter. You're not stuck with one particular brand. You can buy whatever you need. And the other thing is you can do it all with one reel. So if you have one reel with running line, you could service 2 or 3 rods with that same reel and, have, 5, 10, 15 heads that you're swapping around depending on which rod you're using. Not only that, you can change these things very easily in the current. You can be standing in the middle of the river and change a head quite simply. And so that's a big plus. If I'm out fishing, let's say, with a sinking line or sink tip system or whatever, and I decide I want to put on a floater because, the current's not that strong and, I'm starting to hang up too much, and I think I can get away with just a floater, well, I can change that right in the middle of the river. And that's easy. That's great. And it's a couple of minutes and I'm done. That's simple basically if you've got a good technique. So there's lots of good reasons why we should use a shooting head system, and we'll look at the fishing of them in a minute. However, we've got integrated lines too, and integrated lines are all one piece. The beauty of those is, you've got this dedicated line to do a job, and it does it very, very efficiently, and it can be used in quite a number of different ways. The shooting head system is a little bit more restricted, but every time you want to change lines, you've got to have another spool. Like I've got a floater, an intermediate, and a full sinker. I have to have these mounted on spools, and if I want to be able to change, I have to carry all of this on the water. And then when I want to change one out, I have to get out of the river to do it. And then do it on the bank, because I'm not going to try and swap this out in the middle of the river. I've done that before. It's, good risk of you dropping a spool in the water and having it, if it's a good strong current, you wave a goodbye. So, there's the cost involved of having multiple spools. There's the inconvenience of changing and also carrying all this stuff on the water. So carrying a couple of these wallets, for example, it takes up an awful lot less room than a whole bunch of spools, and it costs an awful lot less money. So there are some good reasons why I would want to use one system over another in terms of just practicality of use. However, there's some casting and fishing issues I want to get into, which to me is even more important, and why you should be aware of them before you go out and start buying systems and putting systems together and making choices that may not necessarily be the best choice. Especially if you're getting your information, unfortunately, from a fanboy who likes only one method, you're not always getting accurate information. And as you can see, I use both, so I'm not invested in one or the other in terms of, what I like. I'll use whatever works. So let's take a look at this example here. I'm going to be showing you, my first example here is of me casting a rage head on this Airflow running line. It's a shooting head system, loop to loop. And I want to point out my joint here is 2 to 3 feet outside the guides. So I've got the entire rage head plus some overhang out of the guides. So let's continue on that a little bit. Okay, so when I'm making my cast, my rod was pointed straight downstream, plus I had some overhang, plus I had the entire rage head, plus I had a poly leader, plus I had the leader, plus I had the fly. The fly's a long way downstream. So It's not the type of system I would use if I wanted a fish close to me, obviously. So off goes the cast. Now we're going to see more of a fishing situation. And again, I have to make my cast all the way with the head completely out of the guides, the rod pointing downstream when I make my lift, pointing straight down the line. So when I make my lift, everything is dead straight. So another problem we get into, or I shouldn't say a problem, a complaint. In this next piece, you'll see an issue here that I want to dispel. Okay, there is the running line loop right here, this part right here. I've got a rage head. This was the same day as the previous shot. I've got about a 6-7 pound steelhead on the end here. And you notice that loop is being squished down tight by the tension from that fish. So when it goes through the guides, it goes tick, 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 tick. When it goes through, clatter, clatter, clatter. Who cares? It makes some noise. Some people say it'll catch up on a guide and break a guide. No. When you got tension on it, those loops squish right down. So they make a bit of noise, but that's it. Now, we will see what happens if they relax. Certain loops, not this one, but some loops when they relax tend to lever like this, and it creates issues. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, now we're in Cape Cod. And I'm using an Airflow, a 40 plus cold water salt line, which is a fully integrated line. However, it's made up in two pieces, and they've got a black sleeve like this thing right here. But there's no looped connection, so you'll see the black, but it's all one piece. And you'll notice my rod is almost parallel with the surf. Okay, that's the way I fish. I've got my rod off to the side when I'm stripping. I'm not pointing the rod down into the water. So I'm pulling the cast in, and there is the welded running line joint outside of the guides. And I'm still stripping, all right? I'm still bringing the line in. And I do this because stripers can hit quite close. They can be, 20 foot out there, very close to you. And in fact, I went through the footage from where I chose this, and I don't know, I caught about 10 fish that day on camera. And all but one was caught within that, somewhere around that 25, 35 foot range away from me. The one was caught way out there, but the rest were all close. And sometimes they get ridiculously close. I've caught a striper literally in the wash. My fly was in the wash when the fish hit it. So, there's literally just barely enough water to cover the fish. So don't think they won't hit real close. So now I think you should start to think now, if I was using a head system, you can see where I'm starting to get into some problems. So let's continue this on. I'll pick it up, and there is the welded loop. I brought it past the stripper guide. It's almost in the stripping basket. And I have to work this back out. So I make a roll cast, and then I pick it up and make my cast out. So you can see that if I had a loop-to-loop connection, especially one that tended to flex like this, and I had to roll it back out, that is where you start to get a problem, because it starts to catch on the guides on the way out, and you don't get an accurate roll cast, because what I'm doing with these roll casts, I have to be precise, and we'll see it in this particular example here. I have to roll it out to get the head just outside of the guide so there's a manageable amount of overhang. I don't want 5, 10, 15 feet of overhang when I'm trying to pick up line. So I have to shoot line out and let it slip and get just enough out. This becomes very hard to do accurately and consistently if you've got a loop-to-loop connection clattering through the guides. So this is in slow-mo. And what I'm doing is a double space setup cast, because my connection is inside between me and the stripper guide. Right there, there's the joint. The welded joint. There's no black sleeve on this one. And then I just make the double spay, and I'll slip line through my left hand, getting just enough line out of the guides, and I start to pick it up, and there's the joint now has moved to that foot or so outside the guides, and then I make my cast. You can see that I needed to let the line slip accurately to get the welded loop, welded connection in the right spot, which is about 2 foot outside of the guides roughly. And I make my cast. So those are the mechanics, and that becomes very difficult with a loop-to-loop connection. So also I want to show you here, I'll stop it, where The back end of the line, this is a 30-foot sniper line, the back end is in the stripping basket. And the reason why I'm doing that, I am waist deep in water in Pleasant Bay, and those fish can hit ridiculously close to you, especially the smaller ones. The schoolies will almost hit under the rod tip. So you have to be prepared to fish very close to you, and then you have to get that line back out. So what I do is I'm slipping line as I'm rolling, picking up and rolling the line out. I'm slipping line to get the head of the line completely out of the guides. So here I'm doing a little bit of a double spay, slip, 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 and then I make my cast. And if you're not going to be able to pull that off very consistently with one of these going through the guides, it's just too difficult. Been there, tried it. I went, oh, not doing that again. So here's where that integrated line comes into play in terms of the casting. Now let's talk about the fishing. Here, same shot as before. I'm stripping line in, fishing for striped bass, and I miss a fish. And that is where the welded joint is in the line, just outside of the guide. So the fish hit. That line is 30 foot long. The head is 30 foot long. I've got about an 8 foot leader. So, adding some overhang there, the fish was about 48, 49 feet from me, judging also from the length of the rod I had out. This is the G Loomis short stick, so it's only 7.5 foot long. So it's about 48 feet away from me when it hit. And then, and I missed it, so I continued to strip, and the head is now pretty well in the guides, and the fish hits again. And this time I hook up. So the welded loop is now around the stripper guide right now. So if I had been using a head system, I probably would have picked that line up before the first hit, because I would be stripping in and I would see my joint approaching and I would start to pick up. So there's a good chance that first fish would not have hit, and I definitely would not have caught the second one, or it could be the same fish hitting twice, but I would not have caught a fish on the second hit because my cast would be in the air. My fly would be in the air. It's got to catch fish. It's got to be in the water. So this is a perfect example of where the fish hit closer than where this joint would be. This joint would be down by the stripping guide. And I wouldn't do that if I was using a head system. So you've got to keep that in mind. Okay, here's another example. There's the joint again. I pull it just inside the guides, and the fish hits, and it's on, and then we can see it slides back out of the guides. Again, I say it doesn't matter with so much for the fish fighting, because the loops do tend to flatten down, but it shows you that I was pulling the line into the guides before the fish hit. That's the point I'm trying to make. I was that close. So let's talk about this issue of your minimum fishing distance with a typical integrated line versus a shooting head system. And for sake of argument, we're going to say both heads are 36 foot long. Okay, so to keep it consistent, same rod, same head, same leader system. So in the first example, I've got 11-foot rod. I'm going to have 2 foot of overhang, and you saw the overhang in the opening image. A 36-foot head and an 8-foot leader, giving me a 57-foot minimum distance. So I'm pointing my rod straight down the line, because when you're picking up your head system, you're pointing straight down the line, and I would just pick it up, make my cast, and away it would go, right? So my fly is 57 feet out there, okay, with that setup. So what if I'm using an integrated line, which is also a 36-foot head? So I've got 11-foot rod, but I've only got about 26 foot of line out of the guides because the joint is back down by my hands. I got an 8-foot leader for 45 feet, and that's with the rod pointing straight down. But as you saw, I start my cast when I'm doing this, because I'm using a roll cast, I start my cast with my rod more or less parallel with the surf. So I'm bringing that rod even closer to me. So I'm down around about 34, 36 feet from me to the fly. So it's a lot closer. And as a consequence, you end up with something that looks like this, where I'm gaining an extra 10 foot or so by putting my rod parallel with the current or with the surf. And when I'm bringing my roll cast, I start from that position. So I'm not doing what we normally do when we're swinging flies and pointing my rod straight down. So there's a huge difference in the fishing, minimum fishing distance between the one example and the other. So the bottom line here is I've gained over 20 foot of fishing distance. And that's assuming I'm stopping when the joint or the end of the taper or the end of the head is in my hands. I could continue, as I showed you in the example with the floater in Pleasant Bay, I can continue to strip and pull a lot of the head into the stripping basket before I bring it out. So what you end up doing with the head system, with this joint, you're forced to leave it outside of the guides in your normal fishing situations. And so you cannot be using it where a minimum fishing distance is shorter than the total length of your system from your rod position. When you're dealing with fully integrated lines, you can pull it in so there's only like 4 or 5 feet of fly line out of your guides. I've done that. Use the drag of the fly, make a roll cast, make a second roll cast, pick it up, bang, gone. You can do it. I do it in Pleasant Bay. I'll pull that line all the way in, and there's only I may be probably 10 foot out of the side of the guides. And I'm lifting my rod up slowly, so I'm still fishing. I'm pulling it up, ready to make my roll cast, but the fly is still fishing. So when I'm actually starting my roll cast, that fly is maybe 10 feet away from me. So the amount of minimum working distance, fishing distance I'm working is quite short. So that's really what it boils down to, whether you're going to use this system versus that system. One is cost and convenience, because this is cheaper and more convenient. But this has the advantage of having a very short minimum fishing distance. You have a great deal of flexibility to how close you fish to versus how far away you fish. And if you're in a situation where you're going to be getting into very close hits, the fish are hitting practically under your rod tip, you don't want to be using one of these things. And so I see people on the striper forum talking about these. And yeah, if they're fishing in an estuary and they're swinging their flies for striped bass, no problem, use this. But, I hear people going out in the surf using this stuff, and I'm going, what are you doing? You're creating problems for yourself. So give that some thought. When you're going out to buy a setup and you're thinking about this head system, thinking about your minimum fishing distance. When we're swinging flies using these systems, works perfectly because we're not stripping in. We're not fishing and stripping. We're swinging. And so the only time we're stripping is to bring the head close so we can make another cast. That's all we're doing. So I would suggest that if you're looking at swinging flies, be it small flies for trout, swinging for bass, salmon, steelhead, by all means, use these. If you're doing a lot of stripping and you're pulling the fly towards you and you're working quite close to yourself, then look at these. And I know there's more cost, and I know they're less convenient, but we can still do it. So that's what we want to think about. And I'll have another video coming up where I'm going to be talking about fishing this particular line, which is a custom line that I put together. It's a full integrated system, but it's based on it's like this orange is like a scout head. And you'll see how I made out with this and the good things and the bad things. So stay tuned. That'll be coming out shortly. Cheers.